Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world, because we know there are people logging on as ever to our Infrastructure Intelligence Live series from around the globe. And a very warm welcome to this latest event in our Infrastructure Intelligence Live series, which is brought to you in association with leading communications consultants BECG, thanks to their involvement for today, and indeed all of our events in this particular series. This is the fifth event in our autumn series of Infrastructure Intelligence Live, and I think the issue under discussion today, which is planning and procurement reform and its role in delivering the nation's infrastructure, is a very important subject because, as we only saw yesterday with the Chancellor's announcement of the extension of the furlough, that we are probably looking at some challenging times economically moving forward through Christmas and into the new year. And I think, as we've discussed on many of our events here at Infrastructure Intelligence, infrastructure investment, the construction industry, development across the board is going to be absolutely crucial in lifting up the UK economy and indeed the global economy out of the recessionary winds that are plaguing us at the present time. We need that infrastructure investment to power recovery, but also, in order for that to happen, we need the right conditions as well to create confidence, investor confidence, confidence indeed from the public as well, in order to move those projects forward. And what we'll be discussing today is whether or not we have a planning system that's fit for purpose, whether that needs to be adapted, amended, tweaked going forward to ensure that we can deliver the projects that we need quicker. And we already know, don't we, that the government are actually looking at that. There was announcements made in the last couple of months about the overhaul of that system. So we'll be certainly discussing some of that at today's event. We'll also be looking at procurement as well, and also the politics of all of this. What is possible, and have our political leaders actually got it right going forward. As ever, we have a great panel to discuss those issues this morning. We have Jim Hamson from Jacobs. We have Pauline Lane from the Planning Inspectorate, Robbie Owen from Pinsent Masons, and Andrew Howard from BECG. And I'll introduce them in order as they speak in a second. But you're all very welcome, and thank you for joining us at the webinar today. Just a word on protocol and procedure. If you have any questions, then please do put them in the chat, and I'll do my level best to get to those questions when we get to the discussion. Our panelists are all going to give a brief introduction of around about 5 to 7 minutes, and then after that we'll basically go into the questions. If you do want to put the name of your organization when you ask a question in the chat, then feel free to do that. More than happy to give you a shout out as far as that is concerned. Anyway, to our first speaker, and the first speaker is James Hamson, who is the Vice President for Major Programs and Projects for Europe from the consultancy firm, construction organization Jacobs. Now, James has been with Jacobs for 28 years, it says on my crib sheet here, who joined the then Davy McKee, which is a blast from the past in terms of a construction company, as a 16-year-old apprentice, and he's now Vice President. So I think there's a strong message there about apprenticeships as well. He's delivered projects and worked on projects between £1 million and 800 million in a variety of industries across the infrastructure sector: nuclear power, water, aviation, rail, mining, across the UK and overseas. So I think we've got someone very knowledgeable and hopefully interesting to kick off our webinar this morning. So James, the floor is yours.
Andy, thanks very much for the introduction there. So the areas I wanted to discuss today is we sort of get to grips with the unprecedented times that COVID has introduced to us. What we believe in Jacobs is the real need for a concrete national strategy in how we deliver infrastructure. The resultant impact of COVID has actually created a fabulous opportunity to do something different. We work with many large infrastructure clients whose revenue streams in airports, rail, has been absolutely massacred. And so from an efficiency point of view, we see this as a real opportunity to do something different. Previously, we were working with clients who want to do something different. Now clients are going to have to look at having to do something different. So as such, we see that as a real opportunity. As you saw recently, the Chancellor indicated that they were looking to invest over 600 billion in infrastructure, which is a huge task in that how we will recover from an economic perspective. And at Jacobs, we're looking at sort of seeing how do we actually rationalise and make that a coherent strategy. And there's 4 areas that I just wanted to pick up on there, Andy. The first one is the rethink of the procurement frameworks. So what we see is a lot of the frameworks exclusively on minimising cost, and cost, the lowest cost being their measure of value, which in most cases we see is not the case. The implications of cost, minimising cost as the measure of successful bids, forces companies to look at their overhead structures, to try and streamline as many things as possible to make their cost base as low as possible to be competitive against their various competitors. I think in that aspect, what you do is you lose the opportunity to look to reinvest, to look at innovative solutions, and looking at various other ways of adding value. It doesn't lend itself to that. We see the emergence of the Institute of Civil Engineers Project 13 framework as a great opportunity to look at a more enterprise output-based model, as opposed to looking at the input of a cost. I think the second perspective as well is trying to embed social value into the heart of planning. When we look at the sort of changing environment, what the new future of working will be, the future dynamics will be, I think it's really important that we embed that social value. We recently sort of acquired a 50% stake in a company called Symmetrica, which is a UK-based company which specialises in social value measurement and well-being analysis. And I think the embedment of that within the planning phase of the development of the programmes looking forward will be key. I think the third sort of measure is looking at the improving cross-sector collaboration. We see programs, I work on certain large infrastructure programs, some of which are about capacity, but actually some of them, whilst they might be a rail related, are actually social projects that just happen to have a railway associated with it. There's a couple in the north, close to your heart, Andy, which actually is not about the railway, it's about the social impact and the impact that the cities gain by having this increased infrastructure. So I think one of the approaches in where we see the link up coming from departments, the closer collaboration by some of the departments to lead some of these infrastructure opportunities for the greater good of our society. I think also from that collaboration point of view, contracts that come out set culture. We talk a lot about culture and behaviours. Contracts set those things, and we need to create, the contract needs to create the environment to enable us to be innovative, collaborative, cross-sector type of approach. And finally, to look at the sort of cutting down the time it takes to get through planning, developing, delivering. We need to look at ourselves as an industry, first of all, before looking elsewhere. So looking at how we're reducing design costs, how we're looking at repeatability, then having a look at how much time we're spending ourselves in planning. We seem to have this sort of real passion about getting onto the construction site as fast as possible, and the driver and then push for that. When in fact we we don't, in our opinion, spend enough time in that planning phase to reduce the construction phase. And then once we're in construction, the standardization, we're looking to sort of, rather than repeat everything, if you look back on a construction site now, apart from safety, it does look quite similar into the last sort of 30 years. And so from one of the key enablers to this, what we would be suggesting is the cross-party commitments. So we don't want to be tied to the 4-year cycle. Looking at those cross-party commitments to the future of these programs is key to give stability, clarity, confidence in the market to be able to invest. And so helping to minimizing the approval time for these processes as well, and cutting down some of the bureaucratic barriers, service level agreement time things really adds a hell of a lot of time when you look at the value map of where the added value is in that time scale is quite minimal. And so from a Jacobs perspective, we work on challenging today and reinventing tomorrow. And so it completely aligns with our sort of strapline and where we're going forward. And just to sort of wrap up on there, I'd like to reiterate that this is an opportunity we have, an unprecedented opportunity due to COVID to change how we do things. The burning platform that COVID has created is created a perfect environment to enable us to change going forward. And that concludes my section, Andy.
Thanks very much for that, James. And I'm sure that we'll basically come back on a number of those issues as we move forward. I think, you're not the first person to have talked about social value and the greater good. And personally, I believe that is absolutely critical, not just in relation to winning support for infrastructure development. I also actually think it's critical for actually making our sector a much more attractive place in which to work as well, because, you only have to look at anybody's marketing collateral and they talk about changing lives. You said it there, reinventing the future. But basically, that's what this industry does, and changes people's lives for the better. So I think we really, really need to stress that I think a lot more, and also an important point that you made about cross-party commitment, which I think again is absolutely vital, particularly when we talk about some of these longer-term infrastructure projects that can take many, many years to come to fruition. So a lot there, I think, to come back to in the discussion. Just a reminder to our audience: keep posting questions in the chat so that we can pose those to our panelists at the end of our opening phase. Our next speaker is Pauline Lane, who is the professional lead for infrastructure at the Planning Inspectorate. So a very influential individual from a very influential organisation for our sector. Pauline is a civil engineer by background. She's worked on many major infrastructure projects around the UK. She's a former chair of infrastructure for the Northwest Development Agency. A blast from the past there. Many people hope that those organisations or something like them actually will reappear in the future. She's also a deputy chair of English Partnerships. She was appointed as deputy chair of the Infrastructure Planning Commission and was involved in implementing the Planning Act in 2008. And then she became group manager at the Planning Inspectorate. Anyway, that's enough from me. Pauline, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andy. And yes, I'm not sure I'm influential. The Inspectorate has to be really neutral in its approach, but I think there are some issues around trying to show the framework in which we take our professional decisions, and that's my job, is to make sure that that framework is correct. And I am one of those civil servants who hasn't been in the office since March. And that's because actually I've been sat at my desk here with all of my screens and moving the operation of the Planning Inspectorate entirely online. And if any of you have been engaged in examinations and inquiries over the past few months, hopefully you've had the chance to experience that. So I haven't been in the office, but we have been incredibly busy and trying to reform the system. And part of that has also been a lot of the background and legwork on Project Speed, which you will have heard about, starting from sort of May time onwards, and covered by all of the main players in the system over the summer in various speeches and announcements, and which we are hopeful will be reappearing in a formal external form in a couple of weeks' time with the spending review announcement. So I can't say specifically, but I can talk in general terms about the work that's been done and some of the principles that have been informing that work. But obviously it's a matter for the Chancellor to confirm the actual final details. What we have been doing with Project Speed is taking a genuine end-to-end review of what are the processes and constraints that affect the decision-making around major infrastructure. And that has worked right the way from the initial concepts, how value is assessed, particularly in public sector projects, in terms of, for example, the Treasury Green Book conditions and the various modelling that goes into things. And of course, one of the challenges we now have, and James kind of touched on this in some of his remarks, is that a lot of the traditional modelling just doesn't work at the moment, because a lot of the ways that you calculate the rate of return on things is based on, for example, utilisation. So, you know, that's been one of the interesting challenges about it is, you know, we might have needed reform anyway, but COVID has certainly asked a lot of challenging questions about how we value, say, for example, connectivity over volume. So we have done a complete end-to-end review, looked at every aspect of a project, of which the work that the Planning Inspectorate does is towards the back end of that process, because obviously we deal with the planning application or the appeal or the highways order or the development consent order. But nonetheless, you know, clearly the way in which we deal with those and the issues that we identify as key issues nonetheless influence earlier up the system. So we've tried to play our part in that in terms of understanding how decisions have been made in the past and whether we can do all of that better in the future. I should say, of course, that aside from COVID, there's a lot of other big drivers going on in the system. So the move to net zero, at the moment, as you know, the government changed the target in June last year to net zero by 2050. All the directions of travel suggest that, if anything, that may tighten further. And I think we just need to be aware that that's not only the existing target, but that's probably the outer edge of the existing target. If anything, it's likely to come in. We've got the 25-year plan in terms of the environment aspirations, and that is, although some of the issues within it, such as biodiversity net gain, don't currently apply to things that are classed as nationally significant infrastructure, actually the national policy statements do reference biodiversity. And so whilst the legal metric may not be imposed through the current Environment Bill, nonetheless, the principles are already there. And of course, across the wide range of other processes by which infrastructure is consented, though that's a relevant consideration. We've had sustainability around as a principle for a while, and I should say that from the first time I went on site, where I decided to opt for a wildflower accompaniment to my retaining wall, and everybody looked at me like I was completely mad. Things have moved on a bit, and I think actually the industry has been actually really getting to grips with this now, of understanding some of the higher level concepts of sustainability. And I should also note that we are still expecting a national policy statement on water resources. We've had the consultation on the draft. We're assuming that that will come out into a final form. National policy statements apply to development consent orders, but they are also material considerations in all major infrastructure. So if you've never read one, my suggestion is do have a look now. And the water resources one, yes, it applies to new water resources in terms of the provision of new water resources. And that does include, for example, desalination plants. Not had many of those in this country for a while, but it's the kind of thing which is coming up on the outside edge. But again, it's also potentially a material consideration in other even if you're not delivering a water resource project, if your project affects the ability for water resources to be provided and properly maintained, that will be a consideration in the planning process. So all I would say is I encourage people to look widely at the policy context of their project. So it's not just about the particular technology of the project itself, but about this bigger picture. And in fact, that's actually being increasingly backed up by the finance industry. And I think it's really interesting the extent to which not just public sector finance, but actually private sector finance is increasingly governed by principles which originate from the original Rio discussion about sustainability. That might be because everybody's just decided that they want to become an earth-friendly person, or it actually might be that the finance industry has worked out that rate of return is better guaranteed by having projects which are sustainable and resilient. So I'm not necessarily saying it's out of the goodness of their hearts, but they can do the long-term figures the best as anybody. And I would say do have a look at some of the interesting approaches that are now being adopted by the finance industry in terms of whether or not projects actually are deliverable, because you need that money to come along with it. Mentioned before, James mentioned about the need for a national infrastructure strategy. As you know, the National Infrastructure Commission has been around for a number of years, lots of excellent reports published, really good integrated approach. I think it's one of their particular strengths. They published their assessment a while ago, even in civil service terms, a little while ago. I think we're still hopeful that there will be a formal response with the spending review to the long expected National Infrastructure Strategy. And again, similarly, a lot of other influential bodies in the system have really started to get behind some of that. So, for example, if you look at the commentary that the Institution of Civil Engineers have been providing more recently, and indeed the most recent presidential address in relation to net zero, but also their reports in relation to greening infrastructure. So Project Speed has had a look at all this end-to-end stuff. We will be identifying what we can do that's better in the development consent order process, and in particular, trying to draw out earlier in the process through the direct provision of advice, which will include merits on things. What are the key issues that are going to make a difference to the consenting regime of a project? And it won't surprise you what many of those are. They are not just the things explicitly in the policy statements, but also the kind of good practice items. And that will include issues which are not just about the construction, but also about the operation and indeed the decommissioning of projects. And I would commend to colleagues the National Infrastructure Projects Association, which Robbie may about to speak about in relation to their insight reports, and in particular their Insight 2 report on how to do engagement, multidisciplinary approach, whole life process in how projects are developed, and in particular, for example, early engagement of contractors in identifying the feasibility of solutions. And increasingly within the biodiversity area, for example, not just seeing mitigation as an add-on afterwards, but actually a fundamental part of the project. And we will be looking to see how we can do that advice better, how we can manage the development consent order process as efficiently as possible. If you're not getting a development consent, you might be coming by way of planning inquiry, and we've adopted the Rosewell principles with the aim again similarly of accelerating those, but also being very upfront at the case management conference what the issues are going to be that need to be sorted. And I think that's really helpful to people. And we're also doing a piece of work in relation to, for example, highways orders and transport and work tax orders, which hopefully will include improving the amount of web resources available so you can see other decisions and other projects and how those processes have operated. And that in itself becomes a bit of a database about what are the key issues that are going to affect the decision process. So just to finish, I was reflecting on the time I worked in America, and I went and stood in front of what was the Boulder Dam and is now the Hoover Dam. That was, of course, part of the response to the Great Depression. The project had been conceived long before the Great Depression, but it got permission to proceed during the response to the Great Depression as part of the kind of Keynesian approach to investment. And I just note that it was originally conceived in terms of electricity generation, but it also acts as flood risk management. It acts as an irrigation control resource. It acts to provide a recreational resource with Lake Mead, and indeed it is itself a tourist attraction. Now, not every single project can hit every single one of those principles first up, But I would encourage people to think about their projects, not just in the what it does directly itself, but the context in which it sits, and if it can do, how it gains those multi-aspect approaches to it, because that is going to help the sustainability, it's going to help the financeability, and it's also going to help in terms of how you demonstrate the value added, some of the points that James was making about the social added value. I think we're all big enough now to be able to incorporate that in our process thinking.
Thanks very much for that, Pauline. I think that last point you finished on there is really, really important, and you sort of touched on it when you were speaking as well, this whole thing about the policy context in which people are actually working, because I think if projects and developments can tick a lot more boxes, and not just in a box ticking exercise, obviously, but actually in really making a difference, then I think they'll stand a much better chance of being accepted by all and sundry, really. And I think, again, some other very interesting points you raised there, the increasing importance of net zero. We've done quite a lot of events on net zero and the environment. Obviously, we had COP26 that was postponed for obvious reasons this year. Hopefully that will take place next year, putting the UK and Scotland in particular centre stage on those particular issues. Let's hope that we are in a position to platform some of the excellent work as well that is being done in the UK on that particular issue going forward. Interesting, you mentioned at the beginning and towards the end the increasing role of digital and IT in the planning process, because I think the planning inspectorate and other organisations, we had Warrington Borough Council on a call last week, and many organisations have actually gone out of their comfort zone as well and really move forward from a digital point of view. We know there's going to be more of that in the future, and I think it's right that we actually recognise that going forward. So again, loads of stuff to come back to in the discussion, and I'm sure that we will. But we must move on. Thanks again, Pauline, for that. Our next speaker is Robbie Owen, who is Head of Infrastructure Planning and Government Affairs at the law firm Pinsent Masons. Robbie is, I'm sure he won't mind me saying so, an expert in this particular area around planning in particular. He's got more than 30 years experience. He doesn't look old enough, does he? But anyway, experience of promoting and opposing a wide range of nationally significant and major transport and other infrastructure projects for clients in the public and private sector, and has worked across the infrastructure landscape. So I'm really looking forward to hearing Robbie speak. For me, in fact, all of our speakers done so far today, but he is someone who does explain some of these complex issues really, really well. So no pressure, Robbie, over to you.
Thank you, Andy, and good morning, everybody. Yes, I'm afraid looks can be deceptive. Sadly, I have been at this job for 30 years, but I love it, love every moment of it, or most moments of it, I should say. Yeah, well, there are sort of three things I wanted to say, really, and all of them, to varying degrees, require a lot of input from central government and some parliamentary time as well. And I have to say, it is a concern. Increasingly, I'm sure all of our panel, all of our listeners hear this point about restricted Whitehall bandwidth. And the problem is we're under massive pressure because of COVID and because of things like net zero to make progress everywhere. And yet we are severely hampered by the fact that resources within Whitehall are not what they need to be. And something needs to be done about that, because I just don't think it's an answer to say, well, we can't do this for another year because of we haven't got the capacity. And I think a combination of, for example, I mean, increasingly Whitehall are using sort of task forces for things to take pressure off direct resourcing. And I think that the whole Whitehall bandwidth issue in relation to infrastructure and procurement reform, planning reform, all other areas needs to be looked at. But I make that just by way of an opening comment. There are three areas I wanted to cover. The first concerns the system for getting consent for individual infrastructure projects, mainly the nationally significant infrastructure projects that Pauline talked about. And there is a lot of good work going on at the moment, mainly under the auspices of Project Speed, and we look forward to some announcements about the outcome of that and next steps, hopefully at the time of the outcome of the spending review. I think a particular issue that is growing, that is a growing problem undoubtedly, does relate to the age of the series of national policy statements that Pauline mentioned. They are critical. The Planning Act 2008 regime for consenting nationally significant infrastructure projects depends on this backdrop of national policy statements that set out per sector and subsector the need for the infrastructure concerned, and how individual applications will be assessed and tested, and how issues like mitigation should be approached. The difficulty is that they are getting old. The series of energy national policy statements, for example, was put in place in 2011, so 9 years ago. And since then, of course, a lot has happened, not least net zero. And there is increasing evidence that the age of these national policy statements is slowing up the consenting and therefore the delivery of projects, is leading to increased judicial review. And generally, I think Whitehall is finding the process for reviewing and updating national policy statements, which were supposed to be reviewed every 5 years. That was the intent when the 2008 Act regime was put in place, but they haven't been reviewed. None of them, apart from the nuclear one, has been reviewed at all, and that review hasn't concluded either. And therefore, it's urgently required that ministers look at the process for reviewing and keeping national policy statements up to date. I put forward recently the idea that actually we should peg a 5-yearly review of them with the 5-yearly national infrastructure assessment that the National Infrastructure Commission is charged to produce, which the government then responds to every 5 years. So national policy statements are an issue, and they are causing more problems, and it's critical the government looks into the system for reviewing and updating them quickly across all of the infrastructure sectors that we're concerned with. Other good work has been done in relation to the NSIPS planning regime that Pauline mentioned, looking at end-to-end, speeding up and improving it. She kindly mentioned the National Infrastructure Planning Association's Insights 2 report. I'm NIPA's secretary and was involved in the production of the Insights 1 and the Insights 2 report. Both were informed by some really helpful research from Janice Morfitt and her team at UCL, and Ben Clifford as well, I should mention. And I would encourage people to have a look at the Insights 2 report, particularly. That's the more up-to-date one, obviously, and particularly because it does have some really helpful advice in, I think, about how promoters should view projects, how they should look at issues such as flexibility, early contractor involvement, and looking at the whole life cycle. And it really, I hope, will help to improve general practice. The last thing I'd say about infrastructure planning process and the NSIPS regime, before I move on to my other 2 points, is this, that in terms of getting to an application as soon as possible, so much depends on effective engagement between the promoter or the applicant on the one hand, and all of the statutory environmental bodies, the utilities, other statutory undertakers. And again, I really think government needs to focus on helping those consultees engage properly, because again, to varying degrees, Natural England's a good example, they are severely restricted in their own resourcing, and that really does not help them engage with an applicant as early and as effectively as is really needed. And there's no doubt too, and you see this also with other bodies like Historic England, Highways England, the Marine Management Organisation, and others I could mention. They are under massive pressure themselves. If a way can be found for more effective earlier engagement between them and the applicant, that would really help speed up the pre-application stage. And you're talking about making at the pre-application stage maybe 18 months, not 2.5, 3 years. You can make a big difference, and it helps the process that Pauline and her colleagues then manage when an application is submitted for public examination, because issues as the regime was designed to do, will have been flushed out earlier, hopefully. That's the first issue, Andy. The second issue, in terms of not all infrastructure is delivered through that nationally significant infrastructure planning process that Pauline and I have been talking about. Quite a lot of infrastructure is delivered through the normal Town and Country Planning Act process with consents given by local planning authorities. And of course, as listeners will know, that is now the subject of some fundamental reforms by government set out in the Planning White Paper. The consultation deadline for that finished on the 29th of October, and government's now, no doubt, heavily into the reading of those responses. And the focus of the Planning White Paper was on housing, housing delivery. And I think it's important, though, to remember that certainly some large housing developments should be seen as much as part of our national infrastructure as more conventional economic infrastructure is concerned. And there's a very important element of the Planning White Paper which government is now considering, the sort of what I regard as the infamous question 9C, which is whether the NSIPS regime that Pauline and I were talking about should be made available to allow major new settlements to be consented under that regime. And I think there are some very strong points as to why that would be a good idea. The 2008 regime would need some tweaks and changes, but I would encourage everyone listening to have a look at this and hopefully support the initiative, because the benefit would be that major new settlements, this wouldn't be right for every single one of them, but allowing major new settlements to use the NSIPS planning regime, I think would help to deal with infrastructure alongside housing. It would help to deal with getting all the consents needed in one go, largely in one go. And I think it would be a very valuable additional tool, because there's no doubt that it's the major new settlements that sometimes are very hard to deliver through existing processes, not least because sometimes local government find it very hard themselves to agree on what should be consented. And therefore, I think the benefit of the national infrastructure planning regime for major new settlements is considerable. So that is something I would commend. And I think we do need to think about our national housing needs as much as being a part of our national infrastructure as the more conventional infrastructure projects that we all recognise. The third area I wanted just to focus on a little bit, all to do with sort of structures and delivery bodies, relates to the reforms that have been talked about to development corporations, the reforms that have been talked about by government to combined authorities, making sure that all of the 9 or so combined authorities we have in England all have the same powers on a sort of levelling up basis. This hasn't progressed very quickly, and I think, I mean, we heard, for example, in the budget in March, government's plans to create up to 4 new development corporations for Cambridgeshire and Bedfordshire, and possibly another one for a new town development in Cambridge. It is critical that the framework for development corporations is modernised. The Midlands Engine has been vocal in its plans for a locally led urban development corporation to regenerate 3 large important sites around Towton, East Midlands Airport and Ratcliffe-on-Soar. But again, there is no provision for a locally led urban development corporation. We have 4 different models of development corporations. They're all quite old and they do need reforming. And this again is where Whitehall bandwidth and parliamentary time come in, and the lack of that. So these getting fit for purpose delivery bodies is crucially important as well in bringing forward infrastructure. And I therefore regard the need for reform there. And government did consult on development corporation reform a year ago. I think that's as important as reforming the consenting process itself, the planning consenting process, and as important as making sure our national policy statements are bang up to date and then kept up to date. So Andy, those are the 3 points I wanted to make. Obviously, we look forward to discussing them and the other issues in the Q&A later. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Robbie. As insightful as ever. I think the point that you made there about the age of some of these national policy statements and the need for the government to actually act on looking at these, you know, of course, obviously bandwidth is constrained at the moment, you know, given everything that's happening around the pandemic. But at the same time, it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation, isn't it? Unless the government actually take action to basically create the right environment so that we can actually move forward at speed. And Pauline's mentioned Project Speed earlier on. Then, you know, we run the risk of potentially being stymied as well. Pleased to hear you talk about housing as well, which I think is sometimes overlooked, but it's so crucial to infrastructure development going forward that I think, you know, we have to actually discuss that in this particular context as well. But thanks for that for the minute. Undoubtedly, we'll come back on a number of those points. It's clear here, though, isn't it, that government, both nationally and potentially locally, has a key role to play going forward on all of these
Absolutely.
issues. Which is why it's great that we got with us Andrew Howard from BECG. And Andrew is one of the UK's leading specialists in the politics of planning and development. And, you know, I really like to hear about this kind of stuff because I think it is crucial. Our industry, our sector does need to engage politically. Yes, as we can see from over the pond, it can be a messy business at times. In fact, we see that in our own country as well, don't we? But we can't avoid it because at the end of the day, that's how decisions get made. And infrastructure is, after all, political. Andrew advises a wide range of UK and international clients in his role at BECG. And he has extensive experience of working on high-profile, complex development projects across the country. Like all of our speakers today, he has wide experience across the infrastructure sector. So over to you, Andrew.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that generous introduction. It's interesting when people talk about politics and planning. I remember I was introduced by one of my clients to a consultancy meeting as this man is the necessary evil in the room. And that's how some people feel about politics, I'm sure.
We've all been called that, Andrew, at one time.
Yes, I'm sure. One of the benefits of going last, of course, is that I can wisely endorse all the sensible comments that have been made by the former speakers. I can talk a little bit more about politics, and with respect to Pauline, I could probably be a bit less neutral and more appropriately judgmental about some of the politics that we're all dealing with. And I'd like, given there's been so much about NSIP, to say a little bit more in my emphasis around the Town and Country Planning Act and some of the housing issues that have been touched on. So BECG is a specialist communications consultancy for the built environment, and we're currently working on planning projects in around 25% of English planning authorities. And our projects range from regular housing projects right the way across to infrastructure projects like airports, roads, railways, energy to waste, wind farms, interconnectors, etc. So delivering infrastructure is very much at the core of our business, and the area that we focus on is the community and the political engagement in planning. So how we consult, how we listen, how we respond to communities and stakeholders, it really goes to the heart of the credibility of the decision making for infrastructure projects and also the public support for those projects. So I think what I want to do today is to give you a bit of context. Then I want to say something about the planning reforms and finally some pithy conclusions about what I think might actually happen. So I'm going to try and be brief. Now, as we all know, I don't want to teach you all to suck eggs. So we all know we have two distinctive planning regimes in the UK, the NSIP process and the democratic TCPA process with local authorities. So we've already embedded in our system of planning two quite different systems that reflect essentially the national or the local scale and significance. And that's embedded. Now, we haven't got time really to talk about the pros and cons of each, And I tend to be more enthusiastic about the one that I'm not working on at any particular time. But I think one of the great missed opportunities, and I understand why government haven't done it, but I think there is a missed opportunity to look much more seriously at the crossover between these two regimes. And I would strongly endorse the point that Robbie was just making around bringing housing and large settlements into the NSIP process. I'll say a bit more about that later. So I think there's a general point in my remarks, which is that whilst there's a lot of very good ambition and a lot of good intentions and some excellent work going on, there is a lack of joined up thinking and approaches between different strands of government and between different agencies. The second bit of context that I can be a little bit more political about is that we elected last December a radical government. Yes, a Conservative government, but a government with a really quite different agenda. We have a Prime Minister who is very enthusiastic about big projects. There's a touch of the Mitterrand about his enthusiasm for airports and all kinds of schemes where he can put on his hat and his high vis. And I think that's great. I think both the Prime Minister and the Chancellor are genuinely committed and enthusiastic about projects. But working with them, around them in Whitehall, there's a group of advisors who are very ideological in their approach, particularly to issues like planning and reform of the state. And I think that is creating some issues in the way policy is being delivered. The third bit of context, of course, is that the government came in to get Brexit done. And on the back of that, also to strengthen this new blue wall they have in the north through the levelling up agenda. So with Brexit and with this radical agenda that they came in, it was already demanding. And then on top of that, we have this COVID pandemic. It's pretty hard to think of any government since the Second World War that's had more to deal with. Again, strongly agree with Robbie's points about bandwidth. I mean, there is a critical problem about bandwidth in government at the moment, and that's because government is just dealing with absolutely unprecedented pressures on time at all levels, from cabinet right the way down to public agencies like the Inspectorate and obviously into local authorities. So a bit more about planning reforms. So I'm going to start trying to be positive. It's really fantastic that we have a government that's really committed to development and investment in infrastructure and wants to unblock the system, that wants to use reforms of the planning system to enable delivery. That's great. To be more critical, it's a shame, I think, that for a number of reasons, many beyond their control, I think they're going to fall short in a lot of their ambitions, and that might be something we can talk about. So there's a whole range of initiatives which I want to touch on. I won't mention the Inspectorate initiatives that Pauline's already covered off, but there's 4 others I wanted to mention. There's the changes to permitted development rights and use classes. That's all part of this unblocking the system, making it a bit less of a regulatory burden. There's the white paper on the TCPA planning system. There's the impact of the new algorithm for calculating housing targets. Yes, that's about housing targets, but it has big issues for infrastructure in terms of where those settlements are going to be located. And that, as we all know, kicked off quite a fuss. And then we've got this other white paper, which has been delayed and is held back probably till the spring, around local government structural reform and devolution, unitary mayors, metro mayors, combined authorities, etc. So what you've got is a whole strand of work, and then in addition, the stuff that Pauline mentioned around the NSIP process and Project Speed. So you've got all these strands, and they're all worthy in their own rights. My concern is how they join together and how integrated some of their goals are. And I think sitting behind this, and without sounding too pompous about the philosophy of politics, I think there is an unresolved tension in what this government wants to do between enforcing delivery through central government and its various agencies like the Inspectorate, and empowering local government, regional government, actors and voices. There is a tension there. And I think certainly during COVID, we've seen this constant lurch between imposing from Whitehall and then desperately trying to work collaboratively with the decentralised state, whether it's in Scotland, Wales, or in England. I think that's a theme, and that's one of the areas in which they're getting really mixed up. So to the white paper, my gut feeling, and I speak as somebody who's very much in favour of reforming the town and country planning regime. I think there's a huge amount that could be changed for the better. But I think this is a bit of a wasted opportunity. And I think that's largely because it's a bit of a rush job on the back of coming in after an election. And there's some very good stuff in there, particularly about local plan making, but there are far too many omissions and there's too much detail missing in key areas. It really needs quite a lot more work, not just a response to the consultation that's just finished, but there needs to be quite a lot of rethinking. And it needs to be done in the context of very tight political timeframes. So it's not just rethinking in terms of the detail of the white paper, but rethinking in terms of how it links into local government reform, how it links into the NSIP process and the other stuff that's been touched on. I am intrinsically suspicious of attempts to deliver complex, fundamental, highly ambitious reforms of the planning system. Instinctively, and I'll put the MPPF to one side because that's a glorious success in this respect, but putting that to one side, instinctively, I prefer much more targeted, focused change, which I think can have more impact than holistic, systemic reform. My experience, I'd be interested to know whether other people agree on this, is that in planning, disruption and confusion leads to delays. Well-intentioned reforms to speed things up can themselves lead to delays. And I think a very good example of that is where are we with the local plan process? And there's recently been guidance about not taking your foot off the local plan process, gas as it were, whilst the new white paper is being considered. That all feels a bit of a mess, if I'm honest. And I think what is happening is that there are people in the planning system who do want to delay development, and they may see this all as a cover for that. I think the omissions are a bigger problem. Nothing meaningful at all about Greenbelt, and that's just a massive missed opportunity. I understand the political difficulties, but we can't carry on ignoring this huge elephant in the room. I think abolishing the duty to cooperate, I have no problem with that, but it needs to be done in the context of a proper approach to spatial and regional planning. And that's just not there. And again, there's this second act, which is around local government reform, bigger unitaries, but that isn't there at all. So how you can get rid of the duty of cooperate without talking about regional planning and how you talk about trans-authority structures in the context of local government structures, I don't know. There's so much, and then the other big omission, I think it was flagged up by James, is social value. It's completely extraordinary to me that the entire white paper makes no mention at all of social value. And I think that's hopefully something that will be rectified in the response to consultation. But again, it's an indication, I think, that it was a bit of a rush job and that actually there are people, not on the civil servant side, but on the political advisory side, who have quite an ideological view of some of these issues. There's obviously some great stuff. The emphasis on consultation during the local plan process is excellent. The emphasis on digital solutions is excellent. I think one of the things that all three of our previous speakers have said is how COVID has given an opportunity for new digital solutions coming forward. I mean, at BECG, we're currently working on 60 digital consultations, from major planning infrastructure to housing. It's not a secret that if you'd asked me in February, I wouldn't have been able to find one. There's been an explosion of emphasis and investment in digital. That's great. And I think, the planning inspectorate and quite a number of local authorities have done a fantastic job in responding to that. So that's all great. And it's great that's embedded there. I want the government to be much more prescriptive and much more mandatory about the use of digital in the consultation across. But there's very little actually in the white paper about local authority decision-making and the appropriate role of councillors in determining applications. Again, like Greenbelt, it's a bit of a missed opportunity. It's a bit of a sidestepping of something that could be difficult. And for all the talk of hybrid zoning and early consents for sites that have been identified in the local plan, I don't see how this will obviate the need for detailed and extensive public scrutiny of individual applications. I think it's wishful thinking, frankly, that the local plan process can front end consultation and then you can just get on and deliver. I can't see local government accepting that. And there are many examples already where it's clear that politically this just doesn't float. So at BECG, we did a survey of several hundred councillors across England and asked them some questions about the reforms. 78% thought that these reforms will make planning less democratic, i.e. they will have less control over planning and decision making. Interestingly, 61% of Conservative councillors felt that. And if you add on top of that, the new algorithm for calculating housing numbers, or housing targets rather, you've got a full-on revolt in the Tory shires about some of these measures. So there's a number of other things that need a fresh look. I strongly agree with the other points that have been made. We need to look at the benefits of the NSIP process and see how we can use that for housing. Why can't we have an MPS for housing to take forward large settlements and particularly garden communities? Because these are housing projects where infrastructure is fundamental to their delivery. You know, I'm working on a number myself where major highways initiatives and infrastructure are fundamental to delivery. So that disjunction between those two planning regimes is a problem. And I'd like a lot more radical approach to cross-authority planning. Maybe I'm whistling in the wind, hoping for a reintroduction of regional planning, but I do think that that whole agenda needs to be looked at. You can't just get rid of duty to cooperate without having a strong emphasis from central government and from the inspectorate to enforce local authorities to work more collaboratively together. And then again with infrastructure, fine bringing the new levy. It's not my area of expertise, so I can't comment on the technicalities of that, but we need a hell of a lot more detail on the new levy and how it's going to work. And the point has already been made by the other speakers, which is quite right. You know, we've got demanding net zero targets for 2050. Very interesting to know they might tighten. But how those net zero targets are going to feed into planning delivery, I think is a real question mark. And you know, the fact that so many of the MPSs are out of date is fundamental to this. And that obviously affects procurement because it's all about supply chain. It's about the ability to not just to get planning, but to get it built, and of course the life cycle of the projects. So coming to the end of my remarks now, the other elephant in the room in all of this, as I touched on earlier, is regional and local government structures. The policy wonks in number 10, I think, are quite enthusiastic about creating unitaries, combined authorities, metro mayors. I have no problem with it. I'm a big believer in devolution, decentralisation of power. I'm not sure the Treasury is quite enthusiastic about it as others, but I think that's the agenda that we need to move down. And clearly empowering devolved local leadership can really help. We've seen that with COVID, you know, having an individual speaking for Sheffield, speaking for Liverpool, speaking for Manchester, really I think is quite powerful. And if we had those individuals speaking for infrastructure and taking that joined up regional approach, that would be great. But that white paper has been delayed. It's really politically problematic within the Conservative Party. And you might argue that the experience of dealing with Andy Burnham over COVID means that there's probably some mixed feelings now around this balance between heavy-handed central diktat and then local decentralization of power and engagement. So to conclude, I think there's many reasons to be cheerful. We've got a government committed to investing in infrastructure, fantastic. We've got project speed, which I think is great, and I'm really looking forward to hear what's going to come forward out of that. We've got the embracing of digital tools and consultation, real step change, and I think that's a big step forward. There is, in my view, and I've worked on hundreds and hundreds of schemes involving community response to infrastructure and development of all kinds. I think there is a growing recognition in the public that we need to invest in UK infrastructure, that we need to tackle planning issues, that we need more housing, we need better roads, we need digital connectivity and all those other things. So there is, I think, a growing public spirit that the Prime Minister's latching onto and capturing. There is a support for those projects, but there is a big, big question mark about the politics. And this is my last comment, really. Bandwidth is fundamental. I don't believe, my own subjective view is that when I see the cabinet on the television, they look exhausted, they look shattered. And I can understand why. have they got the energy? Have they got the staying power to really drive through some of these fundamental reforms? I think in some of these government departments, they're run ragged. And I think the more we can push as an industry for things to move into task groups, to move into collaborative structures, where those of us in the development industry can help the public sector to find solutions and move things on, the better. So I think bandwidth is a big issue. And I think the other issue, which is probably I'm the only person who can comment on here, is I think there's a diminishing lack of political capital at the centre. You don't need to be close to the Conservative Party to know that in the Shire heartlands, there's some seriously angry councillors who see their role being clipped and diminished, who see housing coming down the track that they may not favour, and are very suspicious of central government wanting to impose infrastructure from the centre and grand projects which are hugely expensive. The Prime Minister, I think, is under tremendous pressure. I think remains to be seen whether COVID and Brexit will be the political platform on which he goes forth and does extremely well, or whether it sinks him. I don't know the answer to that question. But I do think that when we look at the planning white paper and we look at the overall trajectory of government policy, I have far more faith in things like Project Speed, where you've got professional institutions like the Inspectorate leading and driving, and specific targeted reforms where you've got a clear route to delivery, than I have with some of the wider political ambitions, which I think will just fall by the way. So fundamentally, I applaud the ambition, I applaud the investment, but I think those infrastructure projects that succeed will be the ones where they manage to navigate central government enthusiasm and support, local and regional government, and community support. And that's why, and I would say this, wouldn't I think community engagement in bringing people with us in infrastructure is fundamental to our ability to deliver. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Andrew, for that. Almost a tour de force, really, in terms of the, particularly the, some of the stuff that you drew up there around the politics of all this, which obviously is absolutely crucial to everything. And, who knows how things are going to pan out. I think what is clear is that the politicians do need the assistance of professionals within the infrastructure sector. I think the points you made about a joined up approach, particularly, from a local authority and I suppose local democracy perspective, which cannot be ignored in all of this, because it is critical to, to the planning process as well. And I think there's quite a lot in the government's in tray, as all of the speakers have mentioned so far, in relation to things like local devolution linked reform, regional development organisations, and the like. So there's actually quite a lot there that needs to be addressed. We're going to get into the questions because we have limited time, as always, and I'm going to kick off with a question for James, Hamson. There's been quite a lot of talk on this webinar, and I'm delighted to actually see that we've had that on social value. And Alan Johnson asks, he says he's been working on social CSR projects for a long time, and he said that in his view, social value community benefits haven't really moved forward at the extent that one would have expected, for a number of reasons. One being how serious clients, the seriousness clients put on monitoring social value, and also how you score that. James, have you got any thoughts on that, of how that, firstly, is that your experience, and also how can we improve that situation?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Andy. Absolutely. I think as the person who raised the question has highlighted, CSR has been around for more than 10 years in various guises. What we're starting to see, though, in the last three or four years is practically an exponential increase in its sort of standing within the industry and in government. You look at our investment in our partnership with Cementrica, which was done in about 12 months ago, is a major investment for us. We see that sort of movement. We're starting to see a massive shift in that approach. You also see from a As a business, we recognise that as well. So we, in my line of business, we were originally building in infrastructure. I now work in the line of business that is people and places. As we now focus our attention as opposed from the asset base into what we're actually building this for, the why question. You also see, so companies like yourself, it's the right thing to do. Safety 20 years ago was the right thing to do. And you start seeing collaboration. There's another question about collaboration with partners and sharing of intel because it's the right thing. And I think social value is the next right thing. The government have started taking this and have issued a procurement sort of social value and procurement model. And that looks at the sort of where we are looking to how we as businesses and suppliers affecting social change and our social impact of that. They're looking at how are the solutions based on the climate, the equality, the employment, the well-being of the impact of the infrastructure. And so these sort of things will be deployed in government world from the beginning of 21, which will help drive that acceleration of these values. So I think we're on the cusp of this major shift into that world. I think COVID has essentially accelerated that maneuver.
Thanks very much for that, James. If we just turn to Robbie for a question and get his insights on this particular issue, and that is, I think it's about, I suppose, incentivization really on contracts. Andy Foster from the Thames Tideway project is talking about the whole collaboration piece, which I think is a strong theme that's come through repeatedly in all of your contributions today. And he says that Tideway's got 8 contractors within 3 joint ventures, delivering 3 high-value construction contracts to deliver the program. And he's asking if financial incentivization is the only way to make contractors collaborate on the delivery of major programs, or is there some other approach that we can take? I don't know whether you've got a view on that, particularly with your involvement with the major projects organisations. What's your view? And I'll turn to other speakers in a minute, but yourself first.
Yeah, I mean, Andy, I can say a little bit about that. I'm not a contracts or procurement lawyer, but certainly I do know from, I did the development consent order for the A14 improvements in between Huntingdon and Cambridge, a major DCO that went through in 2016. And many of you will know that the most elements of that scheme, that improvement scheme, opened many months early in about May of this year. And one of the, I think, real contributing factors there was that the 3 joint ventures there were tied together by a super joint venture, a super JV that my colleague Anne-Marie Friel was in charge of advising on that. And I think that that absolutely covered all sorts of behavioural issues to encourage collaboration. I'm sure there were some financial elements to it, but I'm also sure there were some many other elements to it. So that approach, which I know Chris Taylor, who's in charge of that project for Highways England, is feeding into the DFT's acceleration unit. That approach, I think, really has quite clearly helped make sure that that major project, over $1 billion, several £billion actually, opened 9-10 months early, I think. And I believe the same approach has now been applied to tie together in a similar super JV the various joint ventures for HS1 phase 1. So I think there's definitely emerging best practice here in that area. But as I say, it's not one that I know much more about than I've just said. But okay, Anne-Marie Friel is the lady to speak to at my firm.
Thanks for that, Robbie. Just a question from Chris Haley from Turner and Townsend, and he mentions the issue of COVID, which is obviously driving policy and behaviour change en masse in a number of areas. It's already been mentioned about the environment, about digital. Does this provide, that is, the whole COVID situation. We have to be careful about calling it an opportunity in that sense, although obviously, frankly, it is an opportunity to do things different. Does this provide the opportunity to introduce a leaner approach to infrastructure policy and procurement, particularly in reference to achieving net zero and a sustainable future? And if I can maybe just get Pauline's observations on that first, because you did mention something about sustainability when you spoke, and then I'll turn to other panelists in a second. So, you know, does COVID provide an opportunity in that area?
So I think it'll do two things. I think one, it will bring forward the rate of change in directions which were already in existence. I mean, certainly that was my own experience. I mean, we were planning to trial fully online hearings as part of an improvement programme on a sample basis within this financial year. We've shifted the whole business. So, you know, there'll be somewhere people already had a direction of travel and it's kind of acceleration. I've heard people say it's kind of changed 5 years worth of innovation through in a few months. And that's certainly been my own experience. I think it will also challenge some of our inbuilt assumptions. I mean, you know, you can't get away from the fact that, you know, the pattern of work has changed. And the idea, when you look at it now, the idea of moving millions of people every day from one location to another location and back again, you know, to what extent is that ever going to go back in that way? It's changed the value that we place on things. So, for example, I think there's been a long-running discussion. I'm very happy to talk about housing, having been a local councillor as well in my past. You know, the value that has been placed on the quality of housing, and in particular, the way in which housing interfaces with, you know, people's ability to live a fully sustainable life. You know, office conversions into tiny bedsits to reduce commuting. You know, again, you look at that and you go, why did we ever think that was the right solution to anything? Whereas housing, I remember when I was English Partnerships, we did a set of developments in Milton Keynes, which had a Tellier provision, and they sold out instantly. And that was 15 years ago or more. You know, we should have seen the direction of travel then, that people wanted to work from home, but they want to work in home in good conditions and they want flexibility. It has absolutely driven the question of the demand for broadband and getting some of the barriers that were there. Funny enough, one of the first video calls I did at the start of lockdown was something that had been planned as a meeting, which was a piece of work with DCMS about what are the, you know, why is the market split within UK broadband providers effectively reducing the speed of rollout, and what that meant. And clearly, you know, any government has got to recognise that broadband provision should be as central as water and electricity now. You know, you cannot live your life without it. So, you know, my own view is, you know, that should be included in the question as to whether or not somewhere is habitable, is not just as it got water, power and sewerage, but actually if it's also got connectivity. And then I also think it will particularly accelerate the question of the value of green space. And that will be green space at every area, every level and every type. Now, if you put all of those together, those work really well with net zero. They work really well with sustainability. They work really well with, you know, good design principles. So actually, you know, as somebody who is a vulnerable person, can't risk ending up in hospital, I'm very conscious of the downside of COVID, but I'm also optimistic that this is going to accelerate the pace of change. And it has made us think about, look, if we've, you know, this is no longer rhetoric, this is the opportunity now to really deliver on good quality outcomes. And that fits very well with the tangibility of social value. Following on from James's comments, and there's some more comments in the questions I can see, I think that the tangibility of social value, you know, in the end, it's difficult to just include qualitative analysis. You want some quantitative analysis, but it is possible to do some quantitative analysis around the health outcomes that are associated with good housing, access to employment, you know, you know, the DCOs, which include, for example, commitments around training, for example, you know, those are really good indicators. It's not just job creation, it's actually enabling the people to take up those jobs. You know, we can do this, you know, and similarly, biodiversity net gain is rapidly becoming a quantitative measure. I just hope it doesn't end up being game playing, but you know, we can do all of this, and I personally welcome all those developments.
Thanks, Pauline. And there's a couple of things I want to come back on in the limited time that we've got available. But the first, and digital is one of them. I want to return to that. But I think it's really interesting looking particularly at the latest announcement from the Chancellor yesterday, and obviously the millions and billions of pounds spent on essentially keeping people alive, if you want to look at it that way, otherwise would be, you know, potentially made redundant. So the cost of stuff, maybe we're looking at all of that in a slightly different paradigm now. I don't know, but Paul New from he's an independent project management consultant, and he mentions about clients moving on from the focus on cost. How do you think clients should be trying to reach a balance between cost and other factors? And maybe it's an argument that we can have with a little bit more persuasion, given the fact that in the current climate, there's a lot of money being spent, more than what ever would have been spent ever before on a whole range of issues. So if I can ask our speakers to answer these questions really briefly, because we've only got about 10 minutes left. If James can just address that first, how do we get clients to, I suppose, have a focus other than cost? Not to say the cost isn't important, it is, but nevertheless, how do we get them to see the bigger picture? And then bring Andrew in to answer that briefly, and then Robbie. James first.
Yeah, very quickly then, Andy. I think the first thing is you've got to show the value of moving away from costs. So a lot of procurement departments use lowest cost as the best value. And what you find is the lowest cost in those type of contracts set the minimum you're going to spend. And then people focus their attention on changes, trying to extend programs to recover costs, increase. And I worked from an alliance where we were very much output driven. Everything I did, every part of the day was about trying to get the output and the asset built. I then switched programs to one which was about cost. And I spent half my week deflecting early warnings, compensation events, which added zero value to the actual output. So I think there are pockets of this. And as I said in my initial section, the Project 13 approach, looking at output, what we need to do is promote those sort of outputs and show other procurement partners there is more than just minimum cost as the best way of demonstrating value. I think if we were looking at sort of this burning platform and we wanted to change this now and reduce construction costs by 50%, for example, with the construction sector deal, 50% is a step change. We cannot just polish and just do a little bit extra, just a little bit better. We've got to do it differently. And that, in my opinion, we need to create the environment to enable companies to feel comfortable at doing something different. There's no precedence, there's no guarantees. Yeah, the way things come out is we want guarantee, we want to make sure it works, and we want it as the lowest cost. All non-conducive to trying to achieve our goal of 50% faster, cheaper, in an environment with liquidated damages and things like that. So it's an education and it's a sharing of best practice more and more, and build that momentum up across the industry, I think.
Andrew, briefly, moving away from cost, how do we win that argument?
Well, I would say, and I say this to lots of clients, that there is nothing more costly than spending another 12 months getting a consent and the process being delayed. So a lot of the conversation with my clients is around the extent to which they need to address community infrastructure agendas. And they need to address things like the design quality, the building beautiful agenda, if you like. But I think delay is fundamental. You won't and you shouldn't get fast-tracked development if it's all built around cost and not quality. And I think that part of the conversation needs to be joined together.
Robbie, any thoughts on this issue?
Yeah, just briefly. I mean, it's the old adage, isn't it, that people know the cost of everything but the value of nothing, as it were. I do entirely agree with what Andrew is saying about it's vital to get the community on board with these projects, and it's so often overlooked. And I think this comes down actually to making sure that each project does have an intelligent client there, because sometimes clients are too remote to what they think is unimportant detail, but actually it's very important detail to communities. And I was involved recently. I secured the development consent order for the Tilbury 2 expansion of the current Port of Tilbury to the east, and that is now partly open and operating. And the Port of Tilbury did an absolutely brilliant job in realising that they are based in Thurrock and that and Tilbury, and that they need and have enjoyed over time very good relations with the local communities, and that shouldn't be any different for the new development of Tilbury 2. And therefore, they made some very important changes to the scheme, and they embraced the local community as the scheme went through the planning process and then during construction. And these things did not cost a great deal, but actually meant a huge amount to the community. So it's really being discerning and making sure that your client is really involved at the coalface, supported by all of us consultants, of course. But ultimately, the client needs to drive this and understand the detail and what's important for the communities.
Thanks a lot for that, Robbie. We're in the last question of the day territory, and I'm going to pose this to everybody in turn. And again, unfortunately, you'll have to be brief. There's been a lot of talk today about the need, to have a fit for purpose. Whether it's a planning regime, whether it's a procurement setup, and obviously changes are needed. And government will need to actually make some of those changes as well. But obviously, we know they're preoccupied at the moment with all sorts of other things. How can we as an industry, as a sector, influence that process to potentially speed up the changes that are actually needed? How do we get the government to listen? And how do we, basically, get our views out there? And if I'm going to start off, first of all, on that question with James Hamson, and again, if we can be brief, that would be great.
Yeah, and Andy, I think it's a consistent message that as an industry we need to put back. I think events such as today and other events that we attend on, having a collective voice to actually go back to government in one sort of what's right for the country, UK PLC. I think from my perspective, looking at the varying challenges from speed to Brexit to COVID, the lack of clarity is causing delays, and for businesses to actually have a consistent message back to government rather than chop and changing all about. And I think events like this, the IPA, the NIC, a lot of the sort of great work they do, just from a collective, we need to have one voice rather than a series of fractured approaches.
Thanks for that, James. Pauline, your views on that? How do we positively influence this process?
Well, if I can speak first as a fellow of the Institution of Civil Engineers, I think a lot of the professional bodies are doing a fabulous job of both in terms of their policy review work and also their best practice. And I think that is extremely welcome. And some of that is filtering into contract type arrangements. I mentioned earlier, I think the financial industry is going to have a big influence on all of this. I think they've really got it now, and you won't be able to fund poor quality work too much longer. So I think that will make a difference. So in that sense, yes, in theory, government, you'd like to see everything lead, in the lead and giving the frameworks and everything. But if there is a vacuum or if there is a delay, there's other drivers in the system. And all I would say is that, there are a huge number of civil servants like me doing our absolute damnedest to ensure that, thoughtful, evidence-based advice is given to enable good quality decisions to be made. And I remain hopeful that post the immediate crisis, some of that will play out. But, I'd always say, look to the longer term. Whatever crisis there is at this point, let's look to that longer term, and let's direct all our behaviours towards that, because, that helps you get over the bumps in the road along the way.
Thanks, Pauline. Robbie, you're already influencing a government. You've mentioned some of the projects that you've been involved with, but how do we influence that process more collectively, I suppose, as an industry?
I think, well, certainly, yes, through projects like A14 in Tilbury, government are seeing that it can be done well, and that's really important to give them encouragement to change policies and systems elsewhere to make sure that more of that doing things well is spread around. I think certainly through NIPA, the National Infrastructure Planning Association I mentioned earlier, we work closely with government and their agencies, including the Planning Inspectorate, Pauline and her colleagues, and hopefully have constructive conversations and just try and help them really. And often I think the tendency can be with national umbrella bodies, membership bodies to sort of launder their dirty washing in public sort of thing. That's not very helpful. And I think private conversations, giving government data and ideas is massively welcomed by them if it's you know, constructive. I think also, so you know, go bearing gifts, I would say, to government in that sense of ideas and constructive suggestions for future change. And certainly, I think some of the other membership bodies that have been mentioned, professional and otherwise, tend to have quite a focus on procurement and contracting and financing and funding, less of a focus on planning. I mean, obviously, apart from NIPA, which is all about planning. And so it'd be quite helpful if some of the other membership bodies, you know, Major Projects Association, for example, the Infrastructure Forum and others, gave a bit more airtime to planning as well as the more commercial areas, those that are seen as the more commercial areas of procurement and contracting, funding and financing.
Thanks for that, Robbie. I endorse what you said there about the importance of planning, because I think in many ways it does join up a lot of aspects of what we need to be doing to actually deliver infrastructure, and it links in with the political side of things as well. And we certainly don't ignore planning and infrastructure intelligence. In fact, just a quick sort of a gratuitous plug for our next In the Spotlight interview on the 20th of November, where we've got Victoria Hills, Chief Executive of the Royal Talbot Planning Institute, in the hot seat. So don't miss that one. But anyway, just to wrap things up for us, because we do have to go. And I know that people probably want to get out for the lunch or go for their walk, which is allowed in lockdown, of course. Andrew, your thoughts on how do we influence, how do we get the message across?
Thank you very much indeed. I think let's be positive about it. Ministers don't go into politics to have arguments. They go into politics to try and do something. They want to do things. Officers in councils, civil servants want to achieve things. So I think the emphasis really should be on identifying incremental change, specific initiatives, quicker wins, tangible, doable changes that can be delivered on. I think as an industry across the board, we need to be cuter on the politics of it. I think professional bodies often could be cuter and more collaborative in the way they play the politics. And I think part of the key is the joint working, the offering of help. What ministers want more than anything is political cover. They want to know that it's going to work, it's going to be successful, that they can look back on their career and say, I did that. But they also want to know that the public aren't going to be outraged by it. So providing cover through community support and community involvement is very important. So I think identifying the wins, work more collaboratively, and probably as an industry as a whole, we could be far better at the PR of projects and selling the benefits of infrastructure rather than waiting in a kind of receptive way to all the flack that you will get from all the obvious critics, because that leaves the civil servants and ministers with nowhere to go and no protection. So I think we can be cuter, but we should be positive about the fact that everyone wants this change.
Thanks very much, Andrew, for that. And thanks to all of our speakers for what I think has been an excellent discussion today. As always, we can only scratch the surface of these issues, but nevertheless, I think, you know, there is a lot more for us to explore on all of these questions. Look out for the report that we'll have up on our website before the end of the day on this particular webinar. And also, I just want to thank all of our panelists today: Pauline Lane, James Hamson, Robbie Owen, and also Andrew Howard from our strategic partners, BECG. Thank you very much for all of your insights. The event's interest continues next Wednesday, when we have the chair of the Committee on Climate Change, Lord Debin, who will be interviewed by myself on Wednesday for an hour. So do try and log on to that one. Our older viewers will remember him as John Selwyn Gummer back in the day. Unfortunately, I'm old enough to remember him more as John Selwyn Gummer than Lord Devon. But hey, there you go. Like Robbie, I don't look my age. But anyway, and also don't miss, I've already mentioned the Victoria Hills in the Spotlight interview that we've got coming up. And then we've got an international roundtable on the 27th of November. But just keep an eye on our website for details of all those events and more that we have coming up. Thank you to everybody who logged on today and for all of your questions. They're really appreciated, and we couldn't do it without you. So our speakers will all wave goodbye in the time-honoured fashion as they do. Thank you very much indeed. And for those that can make it, we'll see you on Wednesday for an interview with the chair of the Committee on Climate Change. Thanks very much for joining us, and we'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.
Andrew, does that mean they've stopped broadcasting then? Okay, anyway, very nice to meet you.